Post-war world and India. Aftermath of the World War II. The impact of the Second World War was different for different countries. Even as the war devastated countries rebuilt their economies, the world saw some new process in place. Three of the most important processes were the establishment of the United Nations, Cold War, and decolonization. General Assembly of UNO.
This international organization is committed to world peace and safety. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the history of the United Nations. Prior to the establishment of the United Nations, the League of Nations was responsible for maintaining world peace. However, after World War II erupted, the League was deemed ineffectual, and the idea for the United Nations was born in 1943.
February 1945. President Roosevelt journeys to Yalta to meet with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They discuss the fate of Europe when Germany is defeated. Stalin promises to participate in the formation of a new world organization, the United Nations.
The title United Nations was first used by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a description for the Allied forces of the Second World War. In April of 1945, the representatives from 50 countries convened in San Francisco to draft the United Nations Charter. Called the United Nations Conference on International Organization, this event was where the charter was signed. On October 24, 1945, it was ratified, and this marks the day the UN was officially born. At its inception, 51 countries were represented, and that number has swelled to almost 200. The organization is charged with upholding international laws and human rights, as well as ensuring worldwide security, economic development, and social advancement. It is separated into a number of administrative divisions that deal with specific subjects. A few examples include the General Assembly, Security Council, World Health Organization, and the United Nations Children's Fund. Throughout its history, the United Nations has handled a number of international incidents and fulfilled its commitments in a variety of ways. The group's first resolution came in 1946, when it called for the elimination of nuclear weapons. It also stepped in when North Korean forces invaded South Korea in 1950, as well as during the Suez Crisis of 1956. The group's environmental interests were shown with the 1987 Montreal Protocol. This agreement was the first global accord in relation to the environment and ensured the protection of the ozone layer. The organization has been honored for its contributions over its history. For example, in 1965, UNICEF was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. However, in recent years, it has also dealt with criticism that it has become irrelevant due to inaction on international skirmishes. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 is one example where the UN was condemned for failing to step in. George W. Bush's Iraq War is also considered by many the result of inaction on the part of the United Nations. While to some the UN has outlived its relevancy, to others it's an indispensable organization. There is no denying that the United Nations has served a valuable purpose over the course of its history.
We come to reaffirm our faith in fundamental principles of peace, justice, and human rights.
Poverty, illiteracy, disease, and inequality do not belong in the 21st century.
Democracy, more than any other form of government, delivers for our citizens.
United Nations Organization, UNO. The principal allied countries like Britain, France, USA, USSR, and China drafted a charter not only emphasized the need to preserve peace and prevent wars, but also the need to ensure human rights, democracy, and eradication of poverty and hunger for all people in the world. The UN thus started with a twin objective of ensuring lasting peace and human development. At the time of its establishment, UN had membership of 54 countries, and today the Cold War was not just a propaganda war. It also saw real fighting and cost around 20 million human lives. However, almost all of the people killed were citizens of the Third World. Proxy war. Right from the outset, the two countries tried to bring the countries fighting for freedom under their sphere of influence. This led to the supporting the two opposing sides in each of those countries. US President Harry Truman authorized support of the anti-communist forces in Turkey and Greece in 1947. The USSR also tried to expand its sphere of influence. To begin with, in 1950s, it had to face the resistance of countries like Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. It sent its armies to dismiss unfriendly government and install friendly governments in those countries. Military alliances. Both USA and USSR were in the possession of nuclear weapons, but knew very well neither would be the winner in a nuclear war. Yet, they formed military and strategic alliances. The West formalized its alliance in an organization known as North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949. To counter this, communist nations made similar alliances and signed the Warsaw Pact. In addition to this, US established regional military and strategic alliances like Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, generally known as SEATO, and Central Treaty Organization, generally known as CENTO. The alliances helped superpowers which wanted to expand their influence to gain access the vital resources like oil and minerals, markets for their products and places to safely invest their capital, military bases to launch their troops and weapons, spread their ideology and gain economic support to pay huge military expenses. Arms and space race. Both the USSR and USA spent huge amounts of money to conduct research into weapons and build arsenals of devastating nuclear arms and missiles which could strike across continents. USSR put the first satellite Sputnik and the first satellite Sputnik and the first human Yuri Gagarin in space. This was followed by intense competition between the two blocs to put more and more satellite and eventually led to the US sending Neil Armstrong and others to the moon in 1969.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff, we have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. 20 feet down, 2.5, picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down, big shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 20, down a half. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footpads are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the LEM now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Tony, this is so great you can't believe it. I believe it, Charlie. It's raining, John. Look at it go, would you, Charlie? You got all your steering, it's great. Oh, this is going to be some kind of different ride.
Мне заверить наше советское правительство, нашу коммунистическую партию и весь советский народ в том.
Non-alignment movement. In 1950s, the world was getting increasingly militarized and divided into two antagonistic camps. The rivalries between the two superpowers for military supremacy, ideological conflicts, and rivalry to gain economic supremacy led to the establishment of a bipolar world. Though this conflict did not leave much space for those who did not want to be involved in either of the blocs, there was an attempt to create one. The leaders of newly independent nations felt the need for a change from the insecure and tense situation. So, in 1955, at Bandung in Indonesia, a conference was held.
War II, where the rise of independent nation states and the Cold War between the USA and USSR. Not only did these new states of Asia and Africa want to avoid the membership of any of the two power blocs, they also wanted an independent foreign policy that would not be dictated by these superior powers. This new foreign policy took the form of NAM. This movement maintains that any nation has the right to freedom and choice of action in the international field. The non-aligned movement is a movement of 118 members representing the interests and priorities of developing countries. The movement has its origin in the Asia-Africa Conference held in Badung, Indonesia in 1955. The meeting was convened upon the invitation of the Prime Minister of Burma, Ceylon, India, Indonesia and Pakistan, and brought together leaders of 29 states, mostly former colonies, from the two continents of Africa and Asia, to discuss common concerns and to develop joint policies in international relations. Prime Minister Nehru, the acknowledged senior statesman, along with Prime Minister Sukarno and Nasser, led the conference. At the meeting, Third World leaders, Nasser, shared their similar problems of resisting the pressures of the major power, maintaining their independence and opposing colonialism and new colonialism.
West Asian conflicts. West Asia refers to the region between Europe and Asia. The term Middle East is also used to describe this area. The conflicts that developed between Arabs and Jews are often described as the West Asian crisis. It was mainly related to the occupation of Palestine, which was inhabited by Arabs, was under the control of Britain before Second World War. In it is situated Jerusalem, which is a holy city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Disappearing Palestine. Let us see how Palestine was in 1946 and how it is in 1947 and between 49 and 67 and in 2012. 5 million Palestinians are classified as refugees by the UN. A movement had developed among the Jews called the Zionist movement, which called for uniting Jews spread across the world and to reclaim Palestine as their homeland and build a separate state of Jews. Matters were also complicated by the discovery of massive oil reserves in the Middle East, especially in the Arabian Peninsula. In 1947, United Nations passed a resolution according to which Palestine was divided into two parts, Arab and Jewish states. The president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, 1918 to 70, made an effort to unite the Arabs. He formed Fedayeen's suicide squads for causing explosions in public places in Israel. In 1956, Israel attacked Egypt with the support of Western powers, and both United States and USSR demanded a cessation of war and a ceasefire. Israel had to withdraw its army. In the meanwhile, an organization called Palestinian Liberation Organization, generally called PLO, was established in 1964 in Jordan and added a new dimension by bringing together all different Arab factions. The region has been constantly in a state of war and terrorist attacks as a result of retaliation and counter-retaliation. The PLO too broke into many mutually warring factions. The Palestinians are still fighting for their homeland and peace under very difficult conditions of exile and warfare. Peace movements, collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War. As time passed, USSR and USA came under tremendous public pressure to roll back the arms race and destroy their nuclear arsenal. This was largely made possible by the coming to power of Mikhail Gorbachev in USSR. He tried to transform the politics of USSR by making it more open and bringing about radical changes. He was a liberal who introduced certain reforms for the revival of their economy and promoted healthy relations with the West. The reforms introduced by the open regime are often described as glasnost and perestroika. With the collapse of the USSR, a new era began in world politics, the era of unipolar world and the era of globalization. India's relation with China. After a long struggle and violent revolution, China became a communist republic. During the colonial rule, McMahon Line was drawn as the border between the countries. Nehru accepted it. Tibet, which lay between China and India, was to be an independent buffer zone. But China annexed Tibet in 1950 on the plea that it was dependent state of the old Chinese empire. This removed the buffer between the two countries. There was a revolt in Tibet which was crushed by the Chinese. Thousands of Tibetans escaped along with Dalai Lama and took refuge in India. India gave asylum to Dalai Lama. This caused a conflict and Chinese started considering India as an adversary. Prior to this, a border dispute had surfaced between India and China. China laid claim to Aksai Chin area in Ladakh region and much of Arunachal Pradesh. Despite many efforts and long discussions, the conflicts have not been resolved till today. China invaded India in October 1962, violating the peace treaties it signed with India. India was not prepared for this surprise attack and suffered much losses. Full diplomatic relations were restored only in 1976. Now, both countries have strategic as well as economic advantages as they recognized as rising powers of Asia.
It's the war they don't tell you about. It's a war that they wish never happened. And half a century later, it is even easier simply not to talk about it, to walk carefully around it, shroud it, lock it away like it was some receding bad dream. And yet, it remains embedded like a terrible, festering scar on a young nation. Independent India was a tender 15 years old when it was humiliatingly crushed by a far more focused, far more relentless adversary, China. For a world that had watched Delhi and Peking, two big promising new nations, grow closer and consolidate a blossoming friendship in the 1950s, the war was a terrifying subversion. As newly established republics in the 1940s, India and China had a healthy and mutual impulse towards each other. Even India's classified official history of the 1962 war says this was for historical, political, geographical, cultural, and sentimental reasons. The diplomatic affection between the two countries became an undeniable template for a world that was recovering after two destructive wars and decades of colonialism. At the pinnacle of their famous mutual warmth, in 1954, India and China signed the legendary Panchsheel, an agreement based on 5 principles that would guide and forever solidify their peaceful coexistence. A pact that intended to build on decades of unbridled congeniality between the two Asian giants. But at every step, as it turned out, India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was being carefully and meticulously deceived, because as China openly reflected its friendship with India, it had all along been putting together covert plans to help itself to sovereign Indian territory. In 1956, China built a road cutting across Ladakh's Aksai Chin area, connecting Xinjiang and Tibet, making the Aksai Chin far more accessible to the People's Liberation Army than its Indian counterpart. In the eastern sector, in the then Northeast Frontier Agency or NEFA, Indian troops began patrolling heights that China saw as a violation of the disputed McMahon Line. In 1961 and early 1962, a series of skirmishes saw the two armies come ever closer to a confrontation. Then, on October the 20th, 1962, exactly 50 years ago, the first Chinese shells came screaming down, and the war had begun. In 1962, the northeast frontier in its vulnerable entirety fell under the command of Lieutenant General Brij Mohan Kaul. General Kaul, an Army Service Corps officer, had been handpicked by Nehru and his Defence Minister V.N. Krishna Menon. He was to lead a fighting corps raised specifically to keep a check on the Chinese. On his first day in the new post, General Kaul visited the Nam Kachu Valley, situated in the tri-junction of Tibet, Bhutan and India. This was the very sector that would be terrifyingly overrun by the Chinese just weeks later. On October the 20th, 3 regiments of Chinese troops mounted a blistering attack along the southern bank of the Nam Kachu River. Prepared for a formidable Indian response, what the Chinese went up against was a pitiful group less than a battalion strong. The game appeared to be up even before the first shells fell. At 5:14 that morning, Chinese mortars began bombarding Indian positions, while an infantry battalion crept up behind Indian lines to cut off Indian positions entirely. A series of tactical maneuvers across the McMahon Line flung the Indian soldiers from their positions. With an overwhelming position of power, the Chinese marched on into the rest of Nefa. On the 22nd of October, the Chinese attacked Walong on the McMahon Line. After some resistance by Indian counterfire, sheer numbers overwhelmed the Indians.
India's relation with Pakistan. As we saw in an earlier lesson, India and Pakistan became independent nations by bifurcating the erstwhile British India. After partition, the conflicts between India and Pakistan became perpetual, the main bone of contention between the two countries being Kashmir. The first war between the two countries took place in 1947-48 for Kashmir, but it did not settle the problem.
In 1947, Britain prepared to end nearly a century of rule over the Indian subcontinent and its 390 million people. Hindus were concentrated in central and southern India, Muslims in Bengal and the northwest. A British commission divided the territory into majority Muslim Pakistan and majority Hindu India. In the chaos that followed partition, 15 million people fled across the new borders and 500,000 died in rioting. 4 border regions saw the worst of it: Sindh, Bengal, Punjab, and Jammu and Kashmir. Among India's 565 princely states, only Jammu and Kashmir had a Hindu Maharaja ruling over a majority Muslim population. India claimed the Maharaja decided to join India. Pakistan disputed this. In October, Pashtuns from Pakistan's northwest frontier province invaded Kashmir with the support of Pakistan's government. In October of 1947, the Maharaja left Srinagar. Indian troops were airlifted in, but were ill-prepared for the cold and altitude. Pakistan responded with its own campaign, and India approached the United Nations to broker a ceasefire, which went into effect on January 1, 1949, establishing a line of control, but no final border. In 1962, China attacked India in the Aksai Chin region of Kashmir, easily defeating India's poorly equipped Himalayan troops. China retains control of the Aksai Chin today. 3 years later, encouraged by China's success, Pakistan sent troops across the line of control dressed as Kashmiri locals. The fighting proved brief and inconclusive. On September 22nd, both sides agreed to a UN-backed ceasefire. Another brief war broke out over East Pakistan in 1971, this one conclusive. East Pakistan seceded, 10 million refugees streamed into West Bengal, and with India's help, Bangladesh was born. In 1999, after both India and Pakistan had successfully tested nuclear weapons, full-scale war was barely avoided when Pakistan tried to seize the Kargil region of Indian-controlled Kashmir. At one time, an average of one Pakistani soldier every 4 days and one Indian soldier every other day died at the Siachen Glacier, and the terrorist attacks in Mumbai in November 2008 were reportedly planned by senior members of Lashkar-e-Toiba, which Pakistan created to fight Indian domination of Kashmir, and which India accuses of terrorist atrocities all over India.
India's relation with Bangladesh. Bangladesh was liberated from Pakistan with the help of Indian troops in 1972. It signed a 25-year peace treaty with India immediately after its independence. However, they have had differences over several issues like sharing of river waters of the Ganga and the Brahmaputra. India also opposed the large-scale illegal migration of people of Bangladesh into India. The Bangladesh government objected fencing of borders by India to prevent illegal entry. It feels that India behaves like a big brother in this region. In spite of these differences, both the countries have cooperated on many fronts. Sikkim, a state of the country, India.